All right, everybody, this is our lecture on style of fighting. We already did this in class, but we're going to talk more about specifically in terms of style. We did the paper ball fight, so kind of got to start on the idea of trench warfare. All right, so ultimately, let's go with this. You're going to fill in the notes, where you see fit. You won't need notes for every slide, so obviously just follow along and fill in, where you need it. All right, so obviously the war started, war broke out, trench warfare, and ultimately the British government wanted to encourage men to enlist. They needed soldiers to fight the trenches, this awful style of warfare. It's very deadly. And at least at first, the common belief was that the war was going to be over by Christmas. And that turned out to be not the case because trench warfare proved to be very difficult. Um, Especially a lot more difficult than what both the Germans and what the French and British thought. Um, so they used advertising posters to encourage this idea of like being in their trench. Others, they're safe in their trench and things are all hunky dory. But again, this is what it is. It's propaganda. It kind of, these posters like this, it creates a false image about really what the war was, as we'll talk about as we go, kind of go further with this lecture. All right, so trench warfare. You guys can see this yellow dot here. This is called the Western Front. As you guys can see, it goes from here, from Belgium, all the way down into Switzerland. And this is where the trench was located at. And that was just one trench. There was also another trench over in the Eastern Front, which was in Russia. So again, there were two trenches. Western Front right here in France, which is the western part of Europe, and the Eastern Trench, or Eastern Front, which was in Russia. So as we kind of alluded to and talked about, this was the type of fighting during World War One, in which both sides really began to really dig in to protect themselves. You guys just did a project on weapons, so because really World War One was the first modern war that we had, where these modern weaponry really played a vital role, where you could not stand up in the middle of an open battlefield and just start fighting because these machine guns, these weapons that were created. Um, would have just caused mass chaos. Um, so in all, there was roughly about 6,200 miles of trench. And also think about like what that does to like the land, like the farmlands. These are once areas where farmers once grew crops. So now you have a loss of food, a loss of production now that these countries have to deal with now and make up. Most of these trenches, again, rule of thumb, I'm sure some parts of the trench weren't quite this deep, but you wanted to have between 6 to 8 feet deep. And ultimately, this is where this Western Front here, this yellow dotted lines in the map here, this is where the war is going to stall out for about 4 years. It's going to be a stalemate, and we'll talk about why it was a stalemate here in the upcoming slides. All right, so here's again, a very general overview about the trench system. So right here where my cursor is, right towards the front, this is like the front part of the trenches where the front line were located at. And obviously over here where my cursor is pointing to, this is the opposing trench. So this area in between, so you see right here, you see barbed wire right here. So this is obviously was used to prevent the enemy from getting into your trench. And this area right here is called no man's land. Why was it called no man's land? Because it was an area where you did not want to be. Because you were exposed, you were above ground, and this is where the machine guns would come into play. If you were above ground, the machine guns on each side of the trenches would try to hit you. Artillery, same thing. Now, as you guys see here, these trenches were very elaborate. Now, I'm going to make this clear. These trenches were 6,200 miles long, so I'm just showing you a little snapshot picture of it. So basically, if you were in the back, you can work your way up to the front. So there were ways where you could kind of get, in the front lines and work to the back. And if you were in the back, you could kind of see down here, they had like dugouts where you can sleep and rest. And then obviously once you had your rest and you slept, you can go back to the front line. So they would constantly rotate depending on what shift you were in. Now again, here's just kind of a picture. Again, you wanted to keep your head above or keep your head below ground. And you don't want your head to be exposed because that's where snipers and machine guns would cause their most damage. So very, very, very dangerous. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit. Now you guys in a project, obviously we're gonna kind of skip through this. I think most of you guys probably already have this in your projects. But World War I was the invention of the machine gun, this was one of the most destructive weapons that they had during the war, and this is one of the reasons why trench warfare started. Because again, if you were above ground and the opposing side had machine guns, um, the odds of you making it out above ground was very, very, very slim. So this is what will require people to dig their trench. Um, then you have, as you guys see down here, you see soldiers that are climbing up the trench walls. Soldiers were expected to carry all their equipment with them at all times, so that's kind of what would kind of slow you down as well. You're expected to keep it clean and in good condition, which is kind of hard to do, guys. Again, when you're in a trench, you're exposed to the elements. So if it's cold, if it's snowing, if it's raining, the destruction that can cause on your weapon. There were cases in World War One where it was so cold during the wintertime where the weapons wouldn't work; they would like lock up. So that was an issue. Constantly being wet and being exposed to the elements was very brutal for a lot of these soldiers. But then you also had the idea, okay, well, how was this war fought? If you're fought in a trench, and how do you win? Well, they would try to implement something called going over the top. So you see these guys here that eventually they hear a whistle and you start to attack, go into no man's land and try to get into the opposing trench. But the problem is that wouldn't last very long. After the machine guns and the snipers would hit you, oftentimes you would either be killed or you'd run back to your trench for cover. So again, they tried to go over the top, they tried to attack the other trench, but a lot of it, for the most part, was unsuccessful. So again, here's also things that were kind of slowing you down. This is kind of a funny, not really a funny, but an interesting graphic to show how British soldiers would come into the trench, like all nice and proper, and look what happened after 3 weeks in the trench. They're raggedy, they're disgusting, their stuff would start breaking down. And you see some, their equipment would dwindle or lack. So you would start losing things. You would get rid of it because you realize the weight's holding you down and you can't carry all those things. So again, as I went to be earlier, posters always showed men ready and willing to fight. So you see this poster here, again, not in danger, trying to encourage citizens back at home to join up for the war. They never showed the boredom of an actual trench. Now, again, when you were in a trench, it wasn't constant 24/7 fighting, guys. Oftentimes you were just sitting in your trench, and a lot of times it was boredom. Like you were sitting there doing nothing, and sometimes you'd play cards, or you would just sit there and write in your diary, or you write a letter home, or you try to find things to do. But oftentimes you were extremely bored, out in the elements. Obviously, you had moments when you were in danger and under attack, which will go over the top and try to attack your trench. But again, a lot of these posters, these propaganda posters, showed a false impression about what war was. So you see here that I'm just kind of clamoring together, talking, nothing else really to do on the front. Obviously, you see the big idea of mass destruction, mass devastation in these cities. Now, obviously, they're not in a trench, but they're out in the city, again, where the wars were fought, with bombs and artillery and things of that nature in terms of the destruction that it caused to these cities. Again, another view of another city that was just pummeled by bombs and artillery during the war. Obviously, another example there, trees just absolutely obliterated. A crater that was developed after a bomb was dropped. Church, city. Now, as I talked about earlier, again, you're fighting in a war for 4 years, and you're fighting in trenches, and you're fighting out in the elements. So you're not like, oftentimes you didn't get the luxury of getting a home with heat. You kind of had to make your own, you had to just deal with it. In some cases, you couldn't use a fire because it would expose where you were located at. So you see, men would be kind of huddling together. Again, this would cause issues and problems with weapons. Guns would lock up. Guns wouldn't work. Equipment wouldn't work because of the cold and freezing. Some people died of hypothermia or frostbite. You get frostbite injuries, etc. So again, you were exposed to what the weather was. These are something called little foxholes, as you guys see here. You dig a little foxhole. It's kind of where you'd sleep. You put a little blanket over top, so just give you a little bit of warmth and break from the wind. Um, but yeah, that was kind of how you lived. Um, the soldiers had very little decent food, and oftentimes the food that they did have, rats were a big problem. Think about why. Dead bodies. In war, so it wasn't uncommon to find rats crawling across bodies and eating and finding scraps that were left behind by soldiers, the things that they ate. So rats were a huge, huge problem, and many times they were the size of small rabbits because they fed on the bodies and they got big and they got plump. Yeah, I'll show you some pictures of that too. You see here, as a game that they would play, the soldiers they play a game to try and capture as many mice as they could. They'd hang them up, maybe even eat them, or just show off like, hey, I killed X amount. But there were stories I was reading about from diaries about how rats would fly across you as you're sleeping, and they were all over the place, feasting on dead bodies, and just a big nuisance, getting into things. So again, very, very disgusting. Also, you see a picture here about how obviously if you're out in the elements, your trenches would be overwhelmed with water. So you're constantly standing in water or being exposed to water, which causes your uniform to be wet all the time. Now, why is this a problem? I don't know if you guys know this or not, but if you ever go into if you ever go into the shower or the bath and you're in the bath for a long period of time, you might have your feet might be wrinkly, your hands might be wrinkly. Well, try to imagine that, but being in water and being wet for a week or two. Basically, what that does, it causes your skin and your nerves to basically rot. And there was a condition called trench foot, and really it was up to the commanders and to the individual soldiers to make sure that men were taking care of their feet properly, taking care of their hands, trying to dry them off whenever they could. Because if they didn't, it would cause this condition as you can see here. Basically, your foot or the area where you had trench foot, or I guess it could be hand or whatever, it basically would cause your skin and your nerves inside your skin to basically rot and basically become dead. And if that was the case, you may have lost your foot, you may have lost your leg, and therefore you couldn't walk and you couldn't be a soldier anymore. So obviously, if you were in command, you wanted to make sure that your soldiers were doing all these things because you couldn't afford to lose men. So very, very disgusting and very tough thing to have. But also, this also was happening in World War II. It also happened in Vietnam, where this was a very kind of common condition, something that was dreaded, that you really kind of had to be cognizant of. And you guys see this here in terms of some of the men that lost limbs because of this, or maybe lost limbs too in the line of duty with being hit. And also one of the things too, one of the consequences too of this kind of warfare was the toll it took on your brain. You're constantly around death. Death is always on your mind. Being scared, going through all those emotions, being in war, shell shock, mental anguish, psychological issues. There became bitterness not only towards the enemy, but even with commanders too. Like you have commanders in some cases are hiding behind their desks and they're sending these men to go on these dangerous missions, and some people it led some bitterness into like not feeling they're valuing like their life. So this really, PTSD and all those things, it's been around forever. It isn't a new concept, but that was something that some of these soldiers really had to deal with. And this was arguably one of the most devastating parts of the war. This was a war where they began to use poison gas. The British soldiers called these weapons Devil's Breath. It forever changed warfare because now you start adding in chemical weapons into the picture. By 1915, the Western Front was stalled. So they basically were trying to figure out a way. How can you get the soldiers out of their trench? You need to get them above ground, and a way to do that is through poison gas. They can't stay in their trench; they have to leave, come above ground. You use your machine guns, and you mow them down. So, guys, the video is going to end. I'm going to go on to the next video, video 2. So make sure you watch that. We don't have much more left, and then we'll go from there.